The cabin had always been my safe place, the one corner of this world where I could breathe without anyone judging me. It wasn't big, not fancy, but it was mine. My father built it with his bare hands 40 years ago, every nail hammered in with sweat and dreams. I still remember sitting on his shoulders as a child, watching the roof go up against the backdrop of the lake. That cabin wasn't just wood and stone, it was family. It was memory. It was love. So when I came home one Friday afternoon and saw a Realtor's shiny black car parked in my driveway, clipboard in hand, and a couple walking around my porch like they owned the place, my heart nearly stopped. And then I saw the glossy sign stuck in the ground right beside the mailbox. For sale, open house today. My chest burned. My hands shook. The cabin wasn't for sale. I stood there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard. My knuckles turned white, trying to calm the storm building inside me. The woman laughed as she leaned on the railing, commenting to her husband about how rustic charm like this sells quick. The Realtor, dressed in a sharp navy suit, turned toward me with that plastic grin plastered on his face. You must be the interested buyer. Welcome, come right in. His voice cut through me like a knife. Interested buyer. No. I was the owner, the only owner, and the realization of what was happening made my stomach twist with rage. I slammed the door of my truck and marched across the gravel, my boots crunching with every furious step. What the hell is going on? On here, my voice cracked, half anger, half heartbreak. The couple froze, their smiles fading. The Realtor blinked, momentarily caught off guard, then quickly recovered. Sir, we're showing this property today. HOA approval has already been processed, and HOA. My chest tightened. I had dealt with their arrogance for years, petty fines about paint color, complaints about firewood stacked too high, even nasty letters about my dog barking at squirrels. But this, selling my family's cabin without my consent, that wasn't petty. That was war. This cabin is not for sale, I shouted, my voice echoing off the trees. The couple quickly shuffled down the steps, murmuring apologies as they scurried to their car. The Realtor, though, squared his shoulders, his jaw tightening. Sir, the HOA board authorized this listing. They claim the property is in violation of several bylaws and that forfeiture is within their rights. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Forfeiture over my father's cabin, my family's memories. They thought they could just erase me, erase everything with a piece of paper and a smug signature. My vision blurred with tears, but behind those tears, fire burned hotter than ever. Get out, I growled, stepping closer. The Realtor stuttered, suddenly unsure, but he backed away, fumbling with his clipboard as he retreated to his car. Within moments, I was alone again, alone with that sign. That disgusting, mocking sign stuck into my land as if I didn't exist. My knees gave way, and I dropped onto the porch steps. For a long moment, I sat there staring at the lake. My father's voice echoing in my head. Never let anyone take what's ours. This land is your home. Protect it. And I knew I couldn't just let this go. The HOA had crossed a line so deep they couldn't crawl back from it. This wasn't just about bylaws or fines anymore. This was about respect, about love, about the bond between a family and the land that raised them. By the time the sun began to set, my grief had hardened into steel. I yanked that for sale sign out of the dirt and hurled it into the woods, hearing it crash through branches, before disappearing. Then I walked to the gate at the end of the drive, locked it tight with a heavy chain, and hung my own wooden sign. Burned into it with my father's old branding iron were 3 words, not for sale, but inside. I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA wouldn't stop here. They would come again, with more papers, more threats, more smug faces, trying to strip me of what was mine. They thought they could scare me, pressure me, break me down. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The following morning, I woke up before the sun, my chest still tight with the memory of yesterday. I didn't even make coffee, staring at the edge of my bed, staring at the floorboards, trying to piece together how the world had turned upside down in a matter of hours. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder, more personal, as if the house itself was whispering, "Don't let them take me." I finally dragged myself outside, the crisp mountain air biting at my face, and walked to the gate. My wooden not-for-sale sign was still hanging strong, but it wasn't enough. I knew the HOA. They were relentless, greedy, and arrogant. They weren't going to back down just because I locked a gate. They saw me as an obstacle, nothing more. And people like them didn't stop until they crushed obstacles. By mid-morning, my prediction came true. A silver SUV pulled up just beyond the locked gate, the engine purring like a smug little monster. Out stepped Richard Malone, the HOA president. If arrogance had a face, it was his. Expensive sunglasses, polished shoes that didn't belong on, gravel roads, and that smirk that said he'd already won before the game even started. I hated that smirk. "Good morning," he called out, his tone falsely cheerful. "We need to talk." I stayed where I was, leaning against the porch post. With my arms crossed, "There's nothing to talk about. The cabin isn't for sale." Richard removed his sunglasses slowly, like he was peeling back a layer of intimidation. "You don't have a choice," he said simply. "The HOA has authority here. Your property has been in violation for years. Improper fencing, unapproved exterior materials, excess wood piles. The board voted unanimously to put it on the market." My jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. "You can't sell what you don't own." "Oh, but you see, we can enforce foreclosure due to bylaw breaches. It's all in the fine print you agreed to when you joined this community." His voice was slick, rehearsed. Like a snake oil salesman who'd pulled this trick before, I stepped closer to the gate, gripping the cold metal chain. "My father built this cabin. Before there was even an HOA, he laid every brick, cut every beam, and poured his soul into this place. You don't get to erase that with your signatures and your board meetings." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, annoyance. Maybe frustration, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You're emotional. I understand that. But at the end of the day, this isn't personal. It's business." I almost laughed, except the sound would have been too broken, too bitter, not personal. Watching strangers tour my porch, touching the wood my father carved, pretending my home was theirs, that was as personal as it gets. You have until the end of the week to vacate." Richard continued, his tone turning colder. "After that, the sheriff will be involved." He slipped his sunglasses back on and turned to leave, his polished shoes clicking against the gravel like a gavel sealing my fate. I stood there long after his SUV disappeared down the road, my fist shaking, my throat burning. Vacate, sheriff. End of the week. The words looped in my head like a curse. For a moment, I felt crushed, like the weight of everything was pressing me into the dirt. My father's voice came back to me again, low and steady, the way it always did when I was on the edge of giving up. "They can take papers. They can take threats, but they can't take your fight unless you hand it to them." That night, I sat at the old wooden table in the cabin, lit only by the glow of a single oil lamp. I spread out every document I had, deed, tax receipts, even the letters my father wrote when he registered the land decades ago. My hands shook as I flipped through them, not just from anger, but from fear. I couldn't lose this place. Not to them. And then something shifted inside me. The grief and panic hardened into determination. If they wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. If they wanted to threaten me, I'd hit back harder. I wasn't just going to defend my cabin. I was going to make the HOA regret ever laying eyes on it. The plan started forming that very night. I made calls, wrote notes, and dug through old files like a man possessed. Every memory of my father, every splinter in the wood of this cabin, fueled me. I thought about Richard's smug face, about that realtor strutting across my porch, and a dark satisfaction began to build in my chest. This wasn't just about saving my cabin anymore. This was about justice, about revenge, about showing the HOA that they weren't gods, they were parasites. I was done being their host. By the time I blew out the lamp, my hands were steady again. My heart wasn't calm, but it was strong. The end of the week might be their deadline. But it was also the beginning of their downfall. The following days crawled by like a storm cloud that refused to break. Every time I stepped outside the cabin, I half expected to see another realtor's car parked at the gate, another stranger wandering around like they owned my family's history. But the locked chain held, and my sign stood tall. Still, the silence wasn't comfort, it was pressure. The kind of silence that builds right before thunder splits the sky. On Wednesday, it finally came. I was out by the woodpile, splitting logs, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Another car. My stomach tightened, but this time it wasn't just one vehicle light, was three. First, the black HOA SUV, sleek and polished. Then a deputy's cruiser, lights off but presence loud. And finally, a truck I didn't recognize, its beds stacked with for sale signs like weapons waiting to be planted. Richard Malone stepped out of his SUV, smirk firmly in place. The deputy climbed out too, but he looked uncomfortable, like a man forced into a fight he didn't want. I wiped sweat from my forehead, tightened my grip on the axe handle, and walked slowly toward the gate. "Morning," Richard said, too cheerful. "I told you we'd be back. You've had your time, and now we're here to enforce the decision." He gestured toward the deputy, who cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir," the deputy started, his voice uncertain, "the HOA claims the property has been foreclosed due to violation of community bylaws." "I'm here too," he faltered, glancing at me, at the cabin behind me, then back at Richard. "To observe, not enforce, not act, just watch." That told me something. Maybe the sheriff's office knew this was shady. Maybe they didn't want to get dragged into HOA politics. It gave me a sliver of hope. "This land isn't theirs to sell," I said firmly. "I've got the deed. I've got the tax receipts. Everything's in order, and none of it says HOA property. They're trying to steal my home." Richard's smirk didn't budge. "You signed the agreements when you bought in. You joined the community. You're bound by its rules." I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck. "My father built this cabin before your community even existed. The HOA came later, and you've been bleeding us dry with fines ever since. But you don't own this land. You never will." Richard raised an eyebrow, unbothered, and waved to the man in the truck. "Put the signs up. Front, back, roadside. Make sure everyone knows this place is available." The man jumped down from the truck, grabbed a hammer, and started toward the gate. Something in me snapped. Before I even thought, I slammed the axe blade into the dirt in front of him with a crack that made the deputy flinch. The man froze, his eyes wide. "You set 1 foot on this property," I growled, "and you won't like how it ends." For a moment, the world hung in silence. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. The deputy stepped forward, holding out his hands. Let's all calm down here," he said carefully. "Nobody needs to get hurt." Richard, though, just smiled wider. "Threats won't save you. You think you can scare your way out of this, but the board is bigger than you. You're alone." Alone, the words stung, because part of me knew it was true. My father was gone. My mother had moved to the city years ago. I had no wife, no kids, just the cabin, just the memories. And Richard wanted to rip even that away. But as I looked at the deputy, at the hesitation in his eyes, I realized I wasn't as powerless as Richard believed. The law wasn't fully on his side, not yet. And if I could prove just how corrupt and ruthless the HOA had become, maybe the community would finally turn against him. I yanked the axe from the dirt and leaned it on my shoulder, my gaze locked on Richard. You want to fight? Fine. But I won't just fight with my fists. I'll fight with the truth. Every dirty trick, every illegal foreclosure, every lie you've buried, I'll dig it up. And when I'm done, it won't be my cabin on the line. It'll be your entire HOA. For the first time, Richard's smirk faltered. Only for a second, but I saw it. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. And the man with the hammer backed slowly toward his truck. Richard turned back toward his SUV, sliding into the driver's seat without another word. The other vehicles followed, gravel crunching under their tires as they disappeared down the road. The moment they were gone, I let the axe drop and collapsed onto the porch steps, my chest heaving. The adrenaline left me shaking, but underneath, the fear was something new. Not just anger, not just grief, power. They thought I was alone. They thought I was weak. They had no idea what was coming. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows felt like an intrusion, like Richard and his pack of wolves were just outside, waiting for me to falter. I paced the floor until my legs ached, memories of my father hammering nails into these beams flashing in my mind. He built this place to last 2 weather storms. But no storm had ever looked like the HOA. Around 2 in the morning, finally stopped pacing and sat at the old oak desk in the corner. I pulled out the box of documents I had gathered: deeds, letters, tax records, even faded Polaroids of my father smiling beside the half-built cabin. Each piece of paper was like a weapon waiting to be sharpened. I knew Richard wasn't bluffing. If he'd brought the sheriff's deputy once, he'd bring him again, and next time the law might not hesitate. I had to get ahead of this. I picked up my phone and dialed the only person I thought might help: Martha Green. She'd lived in this community for 30 years, a widow with a sharp tongue and a sharper memory. Martha hated the HOA almost as much as I did. Richard had fined her twice for planting sunflowers along her fence, claiming they were non-regulation vegetation. If anyone knew the HOA's skeletons, it was her. She answered groggily, but perked up when she heard my voice. They tried to sell your cabin without your consent. Oh, honey, I knew Richard was dirty, but this takes the cake. Do you have proof? I asked, desperation in my voice. Anything: old letters, complaints, people they've wronged? Martha chuckled darkly. Do I have proof? I've got a whole damn filing cabinet of it. Every fine, every threat, every stupid notice they ever shoved under my door. You come by tomorrow, I'll show you. For the first time in days, hope sparked inside me. Not much, but enough to keep me going until sunrise. The next morning, I drove to Martha's cottage. Her living room was stacked with boxes, folders, spilling with papers. She poured me coffee and handed me a thick folder labeled HOA, Dirty Business. Inside were copies of letters, receipts, and even testimonies from neighbors who'd been bullied into selling their homes. Some of the signatures didn't even match the homeowners. It was fraud, plain and simple. They think people like us won't fight back, Martha said, her eyes sharp. They bank on us being too tired, too scared. But you've got the fire, boy. Use it. I spent the rest of the day scanning every document, building a case thicker than a Bible. With each page, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. This was about every neighbor who'd been silenced. Every family who'd lost their home because of Richard's greed. By evening, I had a plan. Step 1. Expose the HOA. Step 2. Rally the community. Step 3. Hit Richard where it hurt most: his pride, his money, his power. But just as I was beginning to feel control slip back into my hands, the HOA reminded me of their reach. When I returned to the cabin, I found my mailbox ripped from the ground, the wooden post splintered and stuffed. Into the dirt where it once stood was another glossy for sale sign. It wasn't just persistence, it was a message. We're watching. We're in control. You can't stop us. I stood there in the fading light, staring at the sign, my fists trembling. For a moment, fear whispered that maybe they were right. Maybe. I was outnumbered, outgunned. But then I looked up at the cabin, the warm glow of the lamp through the window, the smoke rising from the chimney, and I felt my father's spirit pressing on my chest. This was mine, ours, and no one was taking it. I tore the sign out of the ground and dragged it to the fire pit, tossing it onto the flames. I watched it burn, the plastic warping, the bold black letters curling into ash. The firelight reflected. In my eyes, and for the first time, I felt calm. They wanted to break me. Instead, they'd lit something inside me that wouldn't die until this was over. Tomorrow. I decided I wasn't waiting for Richard to come to me. I was taking the fight straight to the HOA board. The morning I decided to face the board. The air felt heavier than usual, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. I drove down to the HOA headquarters, a polished brick building that stood in sharp contrast to the cabins and woods it claimed to govern. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I pulled into the lot. Every instinct screamed that I shouldn't be here alone, that Richard and his cronies had built this place into a fortress of lies. But my father's words echoed again. If you don't stand, they'll take everything. Inside, the lobby smelled of lemon polish and false promises. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with a plastered smile, looked up. "Can I help you?" "Board meeting," I said flatly. Her smile flickered when she read my name on the sign-in sheet, but she didn't argue. She buzzed the door open, and I stepped into the conference room. The long table stretched out like a battlefield. Richard sat at the head, flanked by 6 board members, each one looking at me like I was a stain on their carpet. "Well, well," Richard said smoothly. "The cabin owner himself. We were just discussing your situation." I dropped a thick binder on the table. The sound echoed through the room. "Good. Then you'll want to see this." I opened the binder and spread out copies of documents: Martha's records, old HOA notices, mismatched signatures. "This is fraud, intimidation, illegal foreclosure. You've been stealing homes, forcing sales, pocketing money under the table. And I'm done being silent." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward Richard. Another cleared his throat nervously. But Richard just leaned back in his chair, hands clasped behind his head, that smug smirk never leaving his face. "You think? You're the first homeowner to make wild accusations," he said. "We've heard it all before, and yet, here we are, still standing, still in power. You're wasting your time." My chest burned, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe I am if I keep this here. But what happens when this binder makes its way to the county clerk's office, or the local paper, or every single neighbor you've ever bled dry? That got their attention? The room shifted, unease rippling across the table. For the first time, the board members weren't all in lockstep with Richard. He noticed it too, and his jaw tightened. "You wouldn't dare," he snapped. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Try me." Silence filled the room. For a moment, I thought Richard might actually lunge across the table, but then he forced a laugh, waving dismissively. "Fine. Play your little games. You'll find the legal system isn't on your side. And when you've spent every dime fighting us, when you're broke and tired, then we'll take that cabin anyway. And no one will remember your name." The board members shifted again, but none spoke. Cowards, they were afraid of Richard. Maybe even complicit, but they weren't ready to stand up. Not yet. I gathered my papers and stood. We'll see who runs out of time first. As I walked out of the building, my heart pounded like a drum. Part of me felt like I'd just thrown myself into a lion's den with nothing but a stick. But another part, the stronger part, knew I'd planted doubt in that room. And doubt was poison to men like Richard. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I found 2 fresh HOA violation notices taped to my gate, petty charges about unsightly wood piles and non-compliant signage. I ripped them off and tossed them in the dirt. This was Richard's answer: intimidation, harassment, an attempt to bury me under paperwork until I broke. But as I stood there, crumpled notices in hand, headlights pulled up behind me, it was Martha's old sedan. She climbed out, holding another box of files. "I thought you might need reinforcements," she said with a grin that didn't quite hide the fire in her eyes. Behind her came another car, then another. Neighbors, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Word had spread, and they were showing up tired, angry, fed up with Richard's stranglehold. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, Richard Malone was about to find out what happens when a community stops being afraid. The next night, the cabin glowed brighter than it ever had. Not from the old lamps or the fireplace, but from the gathering of neighbors who filled the porch, the yard, even the steps down to the lake. People I hadn't seen in years stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching coffee mugs, flashlights, and folders stuffed with their own stories of the HOA's abuses. The air buzzed with a mix of anger and hope, like sparks waiting to catch fire. Martha stood by my side, her voice loud enough to silence the murmurs. "We've all been victims, every one of us. They fined me for flowers. They threatened to foreclose the Jenkins house because their shed was too rustic. They bled the Williams family until they had no choice but to sell. And now they're trying to steal this cabin. Enough is enough." Cheers erupted, fists pumping in the air. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. All these people had been silent for so long, beaten down by fear and exhaustion. And now they were here, standing on my porch, ready to fight. My chest swelled with something I hadn't felt in weak strength. I raised my voice, steady but fierce. "This cabin isn't just my fight anymore. It's proof that Richard Malone and his board think they can take whatever they want. But they're wrong. They don't own us, and they don't own our homes. Tomorrow morning, we take this evidence to the county clerk, the sheriff's office, and the local paper. We shine a light on every dirty thing they've done." The crowd roared in agreement. Oh, pshaw. Faces lit with fire mothers, fathers, old veterans, widows. People Richard had underestimated for years. People who finally had a reason to stand. But even as hope surged, a shadow lingered in the back of my mind. Richard wasn't the kind of man to let this go quietly. And sure enough, before the night ended, headlights swept across the driveway. A black SUV rolled up, slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the locked gate. Richard stepped out, alone this time, his silhouette sharp under the beams. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on him. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look rattled. Instead, he smiled that same smug smile and called out, "So this is your little rebellion." Martha muttered under her breath, "Snake." Richard rested his hands casually on the gate. "I hope you're all enjoying your little gathering, because when this is over, every one of you will regret it. You think you're strong together? I've crushed stronger groups than this." His gaze shifted to me, sharp as a blade. And you have no idea who you're messing with? I stepped forward, closing the distance to the gate. My voice was calm, but it carried. I know exactly who I'm messing with. A bully who hides behind bylaws. A thief who steals from his neighbors. And a coward who's about to lose everything. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but I didn't look back. My eyes stayed locked on Richard. For the first time, I saw a flicker in his confidence, a tiny crack in the armor. He turned abruptly, climbed back into his SUV, and drove off without another word. The silence he left behind was thick, but then Martha's laugh cut through it. Did you see his face? HOA knows he's cornered. Neighbors chuckled nervously, but their smiles soon grew bolder. The fear that had chained them for years was breaking, piece by piece. Later, when the crowd thinned and only a few stayed to help clean up, I stood at the lake's edge, staring at the reflection of the cabin lights on the water. For the first time in weeks, I felt like my father would have been proud, not just because I'd defended the cabin, but because I'd found the courage to lead others. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Richard wasn't done. Men like him never went down without dragging others into the mud. Tomorrow, we'd bring the evidence forward, and the fight would turn public, messy, and dangerous. As the last neighbor headed home, Martha squeezed my shoulder. You've started something, boy, and tomorrow you finish it. I looked back at the cabin, then at the gate where Richard had stood. My jaw tightened. Tomorrow wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about tearing down the very walls Richard built around this community. And I promised myself, when it was over, no one would ever try to put a for sale sign on my father's cabin again. The next morning felt different. The sun rose slow and golden over the lake, casting light across the cabin like a blessing, like my father himself was watching. I stood on the porch with the binder under my arm, the wood warm beneath my boots, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt steady. Today wasn't about fear. Today was about ending it. By 9 o'clock, the convoy began. Martha drove her sedan, packed with boxes of evidence. Behind her came the Jenkins family in their old pickup, the Williamses in their minivan, and a dozen others who refused to stay silent any longer. And then there was me, driving at the front with the binder strapped to the passenger seat like it was sacred. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were an army. When we pulled into the county clerk's office, heads turned. People don't ignore a line of cars that long, not in a small town. By the time we carried the boxes inside, reporters were already showing up. Tipped off by someone I had a feeling Martha had been busy making calls. The clerk's eyes widened as we stacked papers on her desk. What is all this? Proof, I said. My voice didn't shake. Proof that the HOA has been running illegal foreclosures, pocketing money, and threatening families for years. They tried to sell my cabin without my consent. It stops. Today, the clerk glanced through the documents, her brows furrowing deeper with each page. She called in another official, then another. Within an hour, the sheriff himself walked in, his presence heavy, his expression unreadable. He sat down across from me, flipping through the binder. When he reached the page with Richard Malone's forged signatures, he let out a long breath. "I'll be honest with you," he said slowly. "We've suspected something was wrong for a while. But this," he tapped the binder, "this is enough to bring the whole damn board down." A cheer erupted behind me. Neighbors clapped. Some even cried. Years of frustration finally cracking open into relief. But I didn't cheer. Not yet. Because I knew Richard wouldn't go quietly. And I was right. That afternoon, the sheriff and deputies raided the HOA office. I was there, standing with my neighbors on the sidewalk as Richard was led out in handcuffs. His face was pale, his perfect suit rumpled, but those eyes still burned with hate. "You think you've won?" He spat at me as they pushed him toward the cruiser. "This isn't over. I'll bury you in lawsuits." The door slammed shut before he could finish. The crowd cheered louder this time, their voices echoing through the streets. For the first time, Richard Malone looked small, powerless. That night, back at the cabin, the porch filled again with neighbors. But this time, there was no fear. Just laughter, relief, and the sound of children running barefoot across the grass, without parents yanking them back in fear of HOA fines. Someone brought pies, someone else brought guitars. And for hours we sat under the stars like a community should. When the crowd finally left, I walked down to the gate. My wooden sign "Not for Sale" still hung there, steady and strong. I ran my hand over the letters. My father's branding iron had burned into the wood. For the first time, I didn't just feel like I was protecting his legacy. I felt like I was building my own. I looked out over the quiet road, the lake shimmering behind me, and I whispered into the night, "They'll never take this from us. Not now, not ever." And in that moment, I felt something lift from my shoulders. The fear, the anger, weight of standing alone. It was gone. Because I knew I was never alone again. The HOA had tried to sell my cabin, tried to break me, tried to silence us all. Instead, they lost everything. And we gained back what mattered most: our HOA, our dignity, and our freedom. And as the cabin lights glowed behind me, I smiled for the first time in weeks, knowing justice had finally come home.